Welcome everyone. We're just waiting a couple of minutes more for people to sign up and then we'll get going.
People on this.
Is your picture there?
No, I've turned it off.
Oh, okay, because I can go out of here if you...
No, it's all right. Sergio is on it, Schneider.
Henry, hi Henry.
Hi, Henry.
But you're not mute.
Hi, Jens.
Hi, Henry. How are you?
I'm fine. Hi, Leandro. Welcome back to SOAS.
Yes, virtually, yes.
Hello, Henry. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm well. I'm well. I'm afraid I have to leave at 6 o'clock London time because I have another Zoom coming in. But anyway, I want to hear what you've got to say.
So let us.
Hi, Sergio.
Hello. Hello.
Shall
Hi,
we
Jens.
Hi.
Sergio, hi.
Shall we, before this descend into old camaraderie, shall we get started? Yes, thanks. So welcome to everyone. Welcome to this Change webinar. And I ask people to mute themselves because the sound quality is better if that is the case. So, but welcome to this Agrarian Change webinar organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, University of London. I'm Leandro Vergara-Camus from SOAS, and I'll be chairing the session. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Sreya Senna from University of Reading and Enrique Castagnon here from SOAS. Today's webinar is a roundtable discussion on autonomy as an agrarian strategy, ? We are in fact publishing a special issue of Journal Agrarian Change on this topic. So the roundtable is also a taster for this special issue. Let me start by welcoming the roundtable speakers, Kees Jansen, Alice Guimarães, and Leandro Vergara-Camus. Kees Jansen is associate professor in the rural sociology group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. His work connects the field of political ecology, certain critical agrarian studies, and international development. His current research focuses on the sociology of pesticides and social movements concerned with pesticides. So he's also got time to think about autonomy. Alicia holds a PhD in sociology from the Institute of Social and Political Studies, UERJ in Brazil. Currently, she works as a researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Socioeconómicas, Universidad Católica Boliviana, and apologies for my very poor pronunciation. Her research focuses on several aspects of state-society relations, including indigenous and peasant movements in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Leandro is head of study and research program in economy and social innovation at the Université de l'Ontario Français in Toronto, in Canada. He moved there last year from SOAS. So it's great to have you back, Leandro, even if only in this limited way. He specializes in agrarian political economy, Marxist theory, social movements, social change, Latin American politics, extractivism, and alternative sustainable development. The webinar is also live streamed on our YouTube channel, and you can post comments and questions in the live chat at any time. You should know that we're going to record this session. We are recording it, in fact. If you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio. Even if you can find the full program on our webinar series on our website, Agrarian Questions. With that, let me start today's program. First, we start out with a brief introduction to the special issue by Kees. The issue is guest edited by Kees Jansen and Leandro Vergara-Camus. Then we have an introduction to the topic of autonomy by Leandro. And then we have the brief presentations by all the three speakers on the main topic of the roundtable. So with no further ado, I will hand over to you, Kees.
Thank you, Jens, and also thank SOAS, the Journal of Agrarian Change, for organizing this roundtable. Ideas to develop a journal issue on autonomy in agrarian studies emerged in a small session on autonomy at the annual conference of the IIPPE in Croatia. IIPPE is the International Initiative for Promoting Political Economy. And Jens supported Leandro and me in submitting a proposal to the editorial board of the Journal of Agrarian Change. Then first, a writer workshop was held in Wageningen in the Netherlands in December 2019, during which the special issue was shaped as a collective effort based on very rich encounters of thought. In the chat, you will find a list of contributors and anticipated articles that we hope will appear in the special issue. The topic of autonomy is a complicated one. We have intended to collect and stimulate exchanges between the different meanings of autonomy with the roots as wide and deep as Marxism, anarchism, workerism, indigenous thinking, and feminism. Apart from multiple analytical perspectives, this also involves different political positions regarding the strategies related to the idea of autonomy: pro, critical, supporter, harsh critic, or everything in between. The debates are further complicated because the situations and experiences that inform positions regarding autonomy are so varied. Knowing that we would never grasp the whole field in one issue, we still wanted the special issue to be a place of dialogue between different perspectives and cases. And Leandro will now outline a genealogy of the concept and how autonomy returns in diverse debates from peasant autonomy to indigenous or revolutionary autonomy. Leandro, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Kees. Thank you, Jens, for inviting us to this roundtable organized around the special issue on autonomy. It's a great pleasure to be back virtually at the Seminar Journal of Agrarian Change. I see people, faces that we had dinners with after the seminar very often. I have really fond memories of the seminar itself, but also of the gathering afterwards. It's a shame that we're still in the COVID period and we can't see each other face to face, but I think this is probably good enough for now. As Kees said, we were all the authors at a pre-COVID seminar in Wageningen, the last seminar most of us went to. And it was really, really interesting to see right away how different people's perspective were on the concept, the idea, the practice of autonomy. As Jens, as Kees said, when we approach autonomy, we're very much informed by our trajectory, our theoretical approach, our disciplinary gaze, and the authors that make contributions to the issue come from different perspectives, different disciplinary fields. For example, at the seminar right away, we contrasted views on the market, for example, on the state. Us Marxists came at the issue from a different perspective that our colleagues, for example, that were working from a Polanyian, more institutional approach. Some of us also had debates depending on the kind of Marxism that we identify ourselves with. So all this plays into the discussion about autonomy, and you can see it within the special issue itself. What is also interesting about the topic of autonomy is that it is a topic that is interdisciplinary par excellence. There's no way really of thinking about autonomy from only a single perspective or a single discipline or even a single approach, because autonomy really is about the possibility of social change or not. It's about also the nature and the modality of political subjectivity. So the possibility of genuine participation in decision-making about our lives, about our collective future. So autonomy involves livelihoods, of course, and households. It involves markets, states. It involves everyday forms of politics. So it cannot be approached from one theory or one discipline. And in our case, people that revolve around the Journal of Agrarian Change, it can also not be simply approached from the perspective of political economy. So in the seminar right away and in the papers, you can see we had to open up this idea of political economy. We had to open it up to political sociology, to political theory, because discussion about autonomy happened in all these fields from all these perspectives. So Case and I had the role of writing the introduction. So in the introduction, we sort of try to cover a lot of ground about the concept of autonomy, its origin, its different incarnations. So I won't speak about all of that because Case will speak about a portion of that in his presentation. I simply want to give you an idea of what the introduction does. So the introduction goes back to the Marxist tradition and to critical philosophy, and tries to jump then ahead and look at how agrarian studies links up with earlier traditions that discuss autonomy. If we think about autonomy in a very broad sense, autonomy has always accompanied, or discussion on autonomy have always accompanied every single period of the development of capitalism and the struggle against it. If you simply look at the Marxist tradition, for example, the first kind of discussion on this could go back easily to Marx and Bakunin debate. So the anarchists versus the socialists. It could then follow up with debates and discussion between Lenin, Trotsky about the Soviets, the role of the Soviet in social change, in decision-making process, in the reconstruction of a different kind of state. Then you could see it also in Rosa Luxemburg's and Gramsci's discussion on the role of a workers' council in social change and transformation. You could see it in the developing world by the influence that, for example, anarcho-syndicalism had in the organization of unions in many places of the developing world, the way Marxism made its way into very different revolutionary moments, the way Maoism in the 1970s and 80s started to influence revolutionary movements. In all these kinds of big discussion, you see autonomy being discussed. And it's being discussed from economic point of view, if you want, how to confront capitalism, how to develop a new alternative to capitalism, but also how to organize laboring classes for revolutionary purposes, and then to establish a new type of society. Then the paper really focuses on two big traditions of the 1970s and 80s, and it's operaísmo, so the workerism approach of Tronti and Negri in the 1970s, 80s, who argued that politics should take front stage in working class struggles, and that we should move away from a kind of structuralist, capital-centric approach to capitalism. Then the other big reference in the autonomy debate of the period is Cornelius Castoriadis, and Alisi probably will speak to that because that's their entry point into the autonomy debate. And it's basically a kind of post-Marxist discussion of autonomy, where autonomy really is about political agency, but the capacity of individuals and collective to really take control of their lives by creating political agency. So those are the things that are covered in part of the introduction. And then the introduction finishes by moving into the discussion on autonomy in agrarian studies and ask more or less the same kind of question that are asked for other subaltern subjects. So it is, can peasant or subaltern ethnic groups confront capitalism? Can they confront the state? Can they find space within markets? How should they organize their community to generate social change? And we look at all these big questions through the lens of several theorists that have used autonomy in agrarian studies. So that's what basically the issue tries to do.
Thanks, Leandro, for this setting the scene of both for the discussion here, but also for the special issue. And I think Kees will move on from here and relate the idea of autonomy to agrarian studies and representization. Is that right?
Yes, more or less, but it is even more focused, I think. My introduction here presents some arguments developed by my co-authors Marc Vicol and Lisette Nicole and me in our article Autonomy and Representation, Conceptual, Analytical and Methodological Problems. And that one is already online in the Journal of Agrarian Change. What we do in that article is that we analyze and critique how the concept of autonomy is used for characterizing the peasantry in the book, The New Peasantries by Jan Douwe van der Ploeg. So we only basically look at that book. A closer look at that book is relevant as it is widely cited in writings on food sovereignty and agroecology. Secondly, it's also one of the few serious efforts to define what is meant with autonomy when we're talking about smallholders. And thirdly, the New Peasantries has a very distinguishing feature. It takes autonomy as central to peasant farming in general, far beyond the theme of social movements. So what I will do, I will first summarize how the New Peasantries identifies autonomy as the essence of the peasant condition. And then I order our critique in 4 topics. After me, Leandro and Annelies will mainly discuss autonomy as an element of collective political projects of peasants and indigenous movements. My topic is different and discusses autonomy as a biotechnical concept. Autonomy appears in the New Peasantries as self-provisioning. The autonomous peasant constructs and maintains a self-controlled resource base based upon an exchange with nature. It involves withdrawal from input markets, and peasants seek to reproduce resources via non-commodity circuits. Other literature on agroecology often cites the New Peasantries for this reason. Farmers become more peasant when they undergo a transition from input-dependent farming to agroecological farming based on local resources. And this results in less dependence on unfavorable markets. Autonomy appears here as labor-driven intensification. This idea of autonomy in the New Peasantries is closely connected with the defense of representation. Van der Ploeg invokes Chayanov to argue that peasants have a distinctive rationality different from the logic of capital.
Hi, how long are you open? Okay, thanks.
Sorry, can I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. The key premise is that peasants do not necessarily disappear due to modernization and may increase as a result of their number may increase as a result of peasant struggle. So for Van der Ploeg, peasants are neither a remnant from the past nor static, and representation is a highly modern struggle for autonomy and dignity. The New Peasantries resonates with the food sovereignty literature that makes, I think, a more specific claim, namely that a production-oriented notion of autonomy is unique to the peasant condition. And practices such as making good manure or constructing a beautiful farm are then seen as peasant-specific forms of resistance. Our critique of this idea in the New Peasantries consists of 4 parts. First, we observe a one-sided peasant bias in the interpretation of empirical data. For example, an increase of new small farming units is taken as an active process of representation. However, it's difficult to interpret situations with an increase in smallholding and a steady decline in the average holding size, such as in the regions in India or Honduras, as a progressive act of representation and a struggle for autonomy. Instead, inheritance patterns that subdivide and shrink farms along with increasing population densities mean that farming households are increasingly resource constrained. It's impossible in such situations to reproduce one's household solely through agriculture, let alone enlarge one's resource base. So the fact that rural households hold onto their small parcels of land, even when their livelihoods are sustained primarily outside of agriculture, signals the precarity of non-farm livelihoods and labor markets, rather than an active desire for representation. Second, we argue that the new peasantries alternates between two notions of autonomy, intrinsic autonomy and relative autonomy, and that its special contribution to the autonomy debate is in fact rooted in the idea of intrinsic autonomy. Peasant autonomy appears in the new peasantries as an ahistorical, decontextualized category. It does not matter where peasants are located and when they act, they are peasant because they struggle for autonomy, a universal feature. The central but untenable view of an intrinsic autonomous peasant is elsewhere in the book softened with remarks that autonomy is relative, which means that peasants have room for maneuver within a context of structuring conditions. We argue that the reference to relative autonomy still fails to justify why the autonomous peasant can be seen as a coherent category. All types of farming, not only peasant farming, have the potential to seek relative autonomy, since every producer, be it a peasant, be it a petty commodity producer, or a capitalist farmer, searches for room for maneuver in markets and technology. When the new peasantries recognizes dependency relations, these are only seen as hostile and located in the dominant social formation labeled as empire, while all benign interrelations exist outside this dominant social formation. So the new peasantries constructs a binary opposition between, on the one hand, empire and dependencies, and on the other hand, peasant farming, which is inherently devoid of dependencies and capital and filled with solidarity. Mark Tilsey has correctly identified and criticized this hyperstructuralism of Van der Ploeg. A third point of critique is that the autonomous peasant is a category that denies the complexities of agrarian classes. The new peasantries, by introducing the notion of peasant as an analytical category, neglects or misinterprets important established insights on social differentiation, reproduction, agrarian classes, and producer categories such as simple commodity producers and semi-proletarians. The notion of simple commodity production, for example, allows us for an analysis of the reproduction of the resource base and labor in relation to capital. With the conflated category of the autonomous peasant, we lose the analytical power of the distinctions between peasants, rural proletariats, semi-proletarians, simple commodity producers, and capitalist farmers. And therefore, the understanding of the role of capital in agriculture and the divergent political struggles around access to land, wages of agricultural labor, input prices, and so on. This brings me to the fourth point and the last point of critique, the neglect of accumulation from below and the existence of endogenous exploitation. Small farmer accumulation strategies and competition fall outside the scope of representation studies. However, autonomy, and I am more in a Kantian sense of freedom of the will, may also be exercised by farmers when they choose to become actively engaged in relationships of economic dependency. A rather extensive literature has now documented that some smallholders actively seek to engage in commodity production and increase external input use without them being pushed into it or being deprived when doing so. Tania Lee, for example, carefully documents the emergence of capitalism from below among island peasant populations in Sulawesi, Indonesia, who engage in commodity production of cacao. Here, smallholders presumably construct their autonomy to engage in commodity markets at the expense of their neighbors. So the notion of repeasantization is silent about such accumulation from below, as this would imply unpeasant-like strategies such as competition coming from within. To conclude, the repeasantization thesis of the new peasantries offers an original yet problematic formulation of the concept of autonomy as essential to the peasant. Although it opens up agrarian studies for studying the politics of the labor process at the farm level and raises relevant questions about the reproduction of the resource base, it is highly problematic in analytical terms. The concept of autonomy cannot grasp different types of labor in agricultural settings that are covered up with the nebulous term peasant. We also argue that autonomy is not something particular to peasants. The desire to be free from close supervision, have control over one's own workday, and have freedom of choice is a generic desire shared by many humans, by many wage laborers, petite bourgeoisie and capitalists alike. So that means that autonomy cannot be a distinctive analytical category for characterizing the peasantry as argued for in the book, The New Peasantries. So I would like to finish with two propositions for discussion and move with this a little bit away from the book. Autonomy is a useless term. Instead, the question is relevant: what kind of dependencies do people prefer? Dependencies come into being as soon as there is a society. Second, proposals for more peasant autonomy too easily think away dependency relationships constructed from below. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Kees, for this very interesting outline, and also for the questions to the end, which certainly are worth thinking through. But before we do that jointly, we will continue with the presentations. And I think it's Alicia next.
Yes, no, first of all, thank you, Jens, and join Kees and Leandro, thank you for you and the Journal of Agrarian Change to organize this space. And thank a lot, Kees and Leandro, for organizing this fabulous special issue and to invite me and Fernanda Vanderlei, that's my co-author, to participate. I will present very few ideas. I hope I can give a broader view what we're trying to do in the article in these short 10 minutes, and we can keep discussing later. The article is titled Between Autonomy and Heteronomy, Navigating Peasant and Indigenous Organizations in Contemporary Bolivia. I wrote together with Fernanda. Fernanda also works, she's the director of the Instituto of Social and Economic Investigation of the Universidade Católica Boliviana. And in the article, we proposed two main goals or two objectives. The first is to offer a more complex understanding of the projects and practices of autonomy in Bolivia, the rural actors, both peasant and indigenous peasant. And the second was to provide new insights for the debate around autonomy, using the Bolivian case, but to think broadly, to illustrate some of the complexities that surround the concept. So today, giving the proposal of this roundtable, I'll focus more on the second aspect, but in the discussion, I could go more in the details of the empirical data of Bolivia. And we propose two questions. First, what are the meanings of autonomy for indigenous and peasant agents in Bolivia? And second, that also will not go because there is no time, it's to what extent during the mass government, in the period of Evo Morales government, 2006-2019, the peasant and indigenous movements have enhanced or hindered their capacity to advance collective projects of autonomy. There's a whole debate there that motivates us on that, usually very simplistic. Some will say that it's utmost attainment of autonomy. The other will say movements were co-opted, but I will not focus so much on that. I will look more in the meanings of autonomy, because I think there was we can contribute beyond the Bolivian debate. And I will start from the end, in case it doesn't give me the 10 minutes, that what 2 or 3 main theoretical claims or suggestions or debates we want to propose. The first is to consider that autonomy is a polysemic concept. So therefore, there is a serious methodological implication to debate autonomy, that the first step, if you want to think about what are the potential and limitations of the concept of autonomy as an agrarian strategy, first is necessary to identify what different actors involved in specific autonomy politics and struggles understand by it. So we do accept, and Leandro already mentioned, our point of view, disciplinary is important to say, we are both sociologists. I work more in the realm of political sociology, Fernanda more in the economic sociology, and our starting point is this broader definition as Castoriadis proposed of autonomy as the capacity of collectivities to choose and decide about their destinies and to give themselves their own law, their own rule. So it's about agency. So that's our starting point. But while we accept this broader normative definition, we also claim that concrete projects of collective autonomy and therefore their potential and limits can only be defined and discussed based on a specific understanding attributed to the concept by the different collectivities in particular circumstances. And this definition, these actual meanings of autonomy are defined in the context of a series of institutions, social relations, and political practices. Therefore, it's not only endogenous understanding of these collectivities, but it's always relational and contextual. So this is the first aspect I want to bring into discussion, that to inquire into autonomy imply the adoption of a relational approach, articulating this broad normative meaning, but really with concrete projects of collective autonomy put forward in different times and space. These, for instance, I think one idea that can contribute us to change the more orthodox view on autonomy is to problematize a well-established tradition of defining indigenous and peasant struggles for autonomy as necessary entailing the withdrawal from capitalist markets and national states. So this is one of the main things we want to problematize. And while we problematize that, we propose a different view that is not straightforward, this withdrawal, this negation, but this is the second aspect, that autonomy is inherently a project that in modernity it's not never either or conditions. So we should talk about degrees of autonomy, more than fully autonomous or not. And it is a project that's in permanent co-constitutive and conflictive relation to its opposite, which is heteronomy. So here we join a very long tradition in critical theory, but that starts from the Enlightenment and go through that to point out that while the discourse of modernity is firmly based in this promise of autonomy, the actual workings of some of the central institutions of modernity, and here in our paper we focus on state and market, bureaucracy and capitalism, the actual workings of these institutions threat permanently this promise of autonomy. So this overarching structure of modernity creates the threat of self-cancellation permanently. So it's always in a constant tension. It's a matter of degrees, is relational, is contextual, and is always in tension with its opposite, which it is heteronomy. So now I go directly a little bit what the Bolivian case can tell us about this aspect and how we got to these findings based on Bolivian rural actors. Methodologically, we resort to a categorization of Bolivian rural population, which is very diverse. We simplify it in 2 groups, indigenous organizations and peasant syndicalist organization. Really is an oversimplification, and within even of these organizations, there is conflicts and debates. Not everyone in one organization have the same idea what it is autonomy, as Keys rightly point out, it's necessary to discuss also these, competition and relations of exploitation from within. The question of gender, for instance, is one strong. But we focus in those projects that were able somehow to become hegemonic in the excluded. So those projects of autonomy that had been voiced and get more space in the public debate of these movements and their demands. Of course, there are plurality of demands, but we focus on the ones that become central in the moment to do a new constitution, in the moment of criticize the government and so on. Already going, so what we found is that, well, Bolivian, we do a whole review of history, and we find that, okay, through the history in Bolivia, indigenous and peasant groups always have managed to retain significant degrees of autonomy, since colonially different from other countries in Latin America. They were able to maintain some degree of autonomy in relation both to state and market, but this was never unambiguously defined or homogeneous experience. And they have a history, all these groups, of a long-term struggle to defend, enhance, and consolidate this capacity of autonomously defining the terms of their own existence as active collectivities. So in this long-term struggle, they develop particular frames, which are not static. They were also changing through the context, as I start saying, depend of the particular context in different moments, institutions, social relations. So there are very particular framings that I might not go such details of the plurality of meanings in the article we do so, but I want to call attention of there are some important overlappings, and these are overlappings is what got us, me and my co-author, to these points related to the concept of autonomy, which I start with. And the main overlapping aspect is that both kinds of organization never seek to retreat from state of market. Instead, they demanded always a broader integration in these institutions, but they were always demanding this integration in their own unfavorable terms. So their projects of autonomy, it's really this integration in the main institutions of modernity, which structure exactly the same that pose the permanent threats of heteronomy. So in the political realm, for instance, their projects entail not only self-government, self-determination, and that they can rule in some kind of territory according to their own forms of organized economic, juridically, politically, but they also ask inclusion and direct participation within the state in different forms. There is the difference. For the peasantry is more through the normal political parties, for the indigenous organization it's more as a quota system, but they want to participate directly in the state. So they're claiming some autonomy and self-determination in one aspect, but this means also to participate. In the economic realm, they also frame autonomy, articulating market inclusion, capitalist market inclusion, with community regulation, reciprocity, subsistence, other forms of organizing economics exchange. So there again, they are claiming autonomy, but they are also claiming public policies that help them to a better insertion and so on. So our claim is that in this sense, not only problematize this idea that autonomy means a retreat, but in the end, also problematize the very same definition of state and market. Because when they claim some level of sovereignty within some space, but participate in the state, they are questioning one of the main definition of the modern state, that's the monopoly of administration of justice, of the monopoly of production of law, and so on, in a model of nested sovereignties that question then the very same definition and understand of state. And also, when they claim that they want to be in certain capitalist market, but with a series of policies and laws that also contemplate the support of different forms of economic organization, they're also questioning simplistic definitions of market in the capitalist free market of the sense. So I don't know, I think I already speak my 10 minutes. So
you have.
Yes, sorry. So I will leave it there and we can keep discussing. I can put more meat and example, but these are the points that we want to call attention. No.
Thanks so much. It certainly relativizes the term autonomy and makes one think, what is autonomy then? Which is a great start. Leandro, over to you.
Thank you, Jens. Hopefully, I'm not going to be asked to give the definition of what autonomy is, because as you're seeing in the previous intervention, there are many definitions of what autonomy is. And I think Kees and Alice are showing us two very different views. And there were many different views within the seminar. Sergio, for example, they were working more with a kind of Polanyian approach to market, about an idea that markets can be created, that market can be organized in different ways. Their paper is on a case in Brazil called El Circuito. The title is in the chat. So what our contribution in the special issue was with myself, with three other co-authors, Victor Breton, Miguel Gonzalez, and Blanca Rubio. Our paper was entitled Peasant and Indigenous Autonomy Before and After the Pink Tide. And what we wanted to do in the paper was to look at a diversity of autonomy experiences in Latin America, and looking at very specific cases. We chose the case of Mexico, the case of Brazil, the case of Nicaragua, and the case of Ecuador. Mexico and Brazil were chosen because of their early experiences of peasant autonomy, and also the case of Mexico because it's the last, arguably the last pink tide experiment with Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And then Nicaragua was chosen, and I see Miguel was part of the seminar today, was because Nicaragua, the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, was one of the first experience of indigenous and Afro-descendant autonomy that groups negotiated with the Sandinistas already early on in the 80s. And the case of Ecuador is a very emblematic case of a very powerful indigenous movement that also manages to bring in agrarian issues, demands agrarian reform, and then establishes an alliance with Correa during the pink tide, and nothing really comes out of it. But interesting experience of indigenous autonomy, though, in terms of jurisdictions on certain policies. So we take those four cases and try to bring them together. And it's, as Alisa's presentation shows, it's not an easy thing to do, because in certain cases, indigenous and peasant autonomy collide and are sort of fought together. And in other cases, they're actually separate struggles. And in the cases that we were looking at, and even in that is even replicated in the literature. When you look at the literature on indigenous autonomy in Latin America, very often you will not find a political economy lens through which it is read. It's going to be read through cultural politics, through reforms of the state, etc. And if you look at peasant autonomy or peasant movements, then you'll have a more political economy, class analysis. And very often the two literature don't talk to each other. So in the construction of this paper, we had problems in really maintaining that double approach. And that's what we tried to do through the whole paper. And we start the paper by defining autonomy, but by trying to define it very broadly, because I think defining it simply in terms of farming methods, like Van der Ploeg, or what Kees says that Van der Ploeg defines it, could be understood as a form of autonomy that not all the actors that call themselves autonomous or struggle for autonomy actually identify themselves with. So we basically tried to identify how many meanings there are in Latin America, at least. And we found 4 usage of the term. The first term is obviously political. And Alicia has talked about it. It is basically about political agency. It's about the capacity to actively participate in policy making, in the decision that of the nation, of the countryside. In Latin America, the term autonomy has historically been used to mean autonomy from political parties and the state, within political movements, within social movement, I mean. So what it really means is political independence. It doesn't mean that social movement that call themselves autonomous or that struggle for autonomy will not collaborate with political parties, but they will seek to maintain a level of distance from these political parties in order to be able to take decisions on their own. So that's the first definition or usage of the term. The second one is more the economic dimension, and it refers to the control of the means of production and natural resources by peasant communities. So land, water, forests, mangroves, but it also, as Alicia is mentioning, it's about control of markets. This idea that you can negotiate your way through within the market on better terms, that you can create different kinds of markets. And sometimes accompanying this, there is an element of avoidance of the market. So the attempt to defend or recover or reinforce communitarian practices that are non-commodified, non-monetized, and some would say non-capitalist. Policy practices like solidarity, reciprocity, barter, redistribution, that very often have cultural norms and practices around them. So in order to sort of organize this diversity of ways of approaching the market from an autonomous perspective, we use 3 terms: market avoidance, market creation, and market integration. So market avoidance are the ones that try to stimulate, encourage exchange that are non-capitalist or non-commodified forms of production and exchange. And there are kinds of these practices within the indigenous and even peasant communities. The other ones are market creations, and it's basically about either creating a market niche or a circuit, like the Sergio example, where that is controlled by producers themselves. Cooperatives could be an example of that too. And the last one is market integration. So it's demand to be integrated within the market with specific policies and supports. So the question here again could be, well, is that autonomy or dependence or interdependence as Keith is arguing? But I think many of the experience or attempts of autonomy take these 3 types of form when it relates to the market. So those are the 2: economic, political. Then there's a third one, which is the indigenous claim for exercising collective rights and self-determination. Indigenous people, but also Afro-descendant, in many regions of the Americas have struggled for this for many years, and they have gained very often recognition of jurisdiction on particular territories. So that's the term that is used when we talk about autonomy for indigenous people. And in Latin America, as Alice is arguing, that has basically been carried out through reforms of the nation state, through negotiations of certain cultural rights, certain jurisdiction, devolution of power, but also new constitutions, etc. Then there's a fourth definition or usage of the term, which refers to the practice of social movements. And that is, the term autonomy was way more popular, if you want, in the 1990s and early 2000. All the movements in Latin America were using the term autonomy to talk about their internal political practice, where members were participating in decision-making on horizontal participatory processes, assemblies, etc. So it was the idea that an organization was autonomous also if it was able to have its membership, its grassroots membership, participate actively in decisions. And that usage of autonomy kind of lost stopped being used with the pink tide, and we'll talk about it a bit if I have time later on. And the fifth meaning sort of encompasses all that. And it's what Alice's again was saying, autonomy is a political project. It is to a certain degree an utopia of certain groups, subaltern classes that want to take control of their lives and their future. And it may or may not be against capitalism. It may or may not be also against the state, but it does involve transforming the state and transforming neoliberalism in one way or another. So what we do in the papers, we take these 5 meanings and try to see how they articulated themselves and how they were practiced from the 1990s all the way to today by sort of splitting these experiences in 3 different moments. And we looked at the achievements, the objectives, the contradiction in each period for specific movements in Mexico, Brazil, Nicaragua, and Ecuador, and which kind of evaluated or tried to assess whether they ended up presenting themselves as alternative to neoliberalism or to political paternalism, which were the 2 main targets of these movements in the early 1990s. And for us, it was important to go back to the 1990s, but because in the 1990s, it is the moment where the discussion, the practice of autonomy includes all these dimensions, and it's understood as a radical change in the politics of Latin America. So our main argument, if you want, I'm going to give away the conclusion to a certain degree, is that these projects of peasant and indigenous autonomy, if we look at them from an historical perspective that goes back to the 1990s, we can see that already from the beginning, from their inception in the 1990s, they entailed very, very serious contradictions. Because movements wanting to solve certain problems by taking certain mechanisms, at the end, they ended up achieving certain things, but also exacerbating the problems, some of the problems that they sought to solve. For example, by seeking to respond to economic marginalization of peasant producers, by creating market organization like co-ops, like new markets, they actually overestimated the capacity to be successful market actor in agriculture that is controlled by agribusiness, that is further internationalized, etc. Also on the political side, if you want, by gaining control of parts of the territory, certain peasant movement and especially indigenous movement, by using decentralized state programs, they actually believed, even though they achieved certain level of control, they believed that the ability to mediate, that those programs would allow them to mediate the impact of capitalist expansion on their grassroots members. But what they actually did was to weaken their ability to act as catalyst of radical social change. A lot of the leaders of these indigenous movement began to work way more into all the policies, all the decision-making process, the negotiation within states, the running of programs, and then part of the mobilization capacity that these organizations had got lost in the years of devolution and administration of these programs. One of the main observations of the 4 of us, the 4 authors, in our cases, actually we realized that while we were writing the paper, is that uniting the peasantry and peasant and indigenous struggle has been the major challenge of rural movements. There has been moments here and there where both struggled, both movement managed to create large coalitions and supported each other's struggle. But basically, very often what happened is that peasant autonomy, for example, struggle for peasant autonomy and support, state support and withdrawal or certain policies, sometimes did not find a strong solidarity from indigenous movements. And the opposite was true also. Struggle for indigenous autonomy and for rights did not always find on their side indigenous peasant movements. So there was constantly like a parallel struggle between indigenous and peasant movements. So that's our conclusion, but we got there, if you want, after writing it and going back and forth between the authors, but also by contrasting what was going on in the 1990s with what went on during the pink tide governments, and then what is going on now, or what actually happened at the end and the fall of these pink tide government. I'm kind of losing track of the time that I've been using. Jens, could you help me here?
You are at the time where you have to wind down or wind up.
Okay. All right. So what was interesting again for us going back to the 1990s was to see all these experiences of peasant and indigenous movement trying to take advantage of the restructuring that was going on. The market restructuring, the neoliberalization of policy was clear to these peasant movements, and they thought that they could at least now kind of organize their own ways into the market by creating cooperatives, by creating all of these new kind of market mechanism, but at the same time, by taking control of certain territories and by reinventing traditional practices, non-commodified practices. So many organizations started using terms like import substituting in order to try to reinforce the resilience of peasant communities, using barter, using non-monetary forms of exchange, linking up communities in terms of the types of things that they produce. There were all kinds of experiments really in the 1990s. The MST, for example, in Brazil, had experiences with cooperatives that were owned collectively, where people worked collectively, worked the land collectively, used the produce that they were produced for their own self-consumption in order not to have to rely on the market. So all kinds of these experiences were going on all over the place, and that is completely lost with the pink tide governments, because during the pink tide government era in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Nicaragua, and Brazil, the movements really rely on state policies. There are new policies. There are the creations of markets in the Lula years, for example. But basically, movements stop really attempting to organize themselves these economic spaces and leave the state, give the state, if you want, that responsibility. And the result is that when these governments fall, well, then there isn't any policy left. And within that period, the movements also changed. The form of organizing internally moved to more classic forms of taking decision, where the leaders were more top down, we could say, and then so the autonomous practices inside movement got lost also during this era, this period, and then we end the paper by looking at what happened through all these through that period in all the countries, and also point to this difficulty of building and maintaining a coalition of peasants and indigenous movement through different moments. For example, in Mexico, we look at the Zapatista struggle, and we point to the fact that the basic alliance between the Zapatista and civil society is with indigenous movements. It's not with peasant movement. And then when peasants organize mobilization to counteract the effects of NAFTA. The indigenous movement does not support El Campo No Aguanta Más or Sin Maíz No Hay País, both movements that were national movements. And we see that in other places too. We see that in Nicaragua, and the paper Miguel covers that by showing some cases where there are alliances between movements because they're able to show that the effects of certain policy affect both peasant and indigenous autonomy. And in other cases, you have actually indigenous subsistent peasant encroaching on the territory of that isn't under control of indigenous autonomy. And then you see the conflicts of tension instead of the possibility of alliance. So that's what our paper tries to do. It tries to seek to show the diversity, the difficulty of autonomy. And by pointing to this difficulty of keeping a broad alliance, we hope that it will stimulate others to do research of that kind, to try to see what are the kinds of conditions and the kind of impediments to these coalitions, because we believe it's a fundamental question for theoreticians, but also for the movements themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leandro, and thanks to all three of you. I think you have certainly managed very well to complicate the picture of what autonomy is, which is great because it means the absolutes sort of fall by the wayside a bit. So it is more a question of, as far as I can see, so why do we use the concept and why do movements use the concept? But now I'm maybe getting a bit ahead of myself. I should first say that we now move into the second half of this event, which is discussion. And of course, it is a discussion between the roundtable participants. It is also a discussion between them and people from the audience. And I'm aware we have a fair few of the authors that have contributed to the special issue here. So it would of course be obvious for them also to comment on the presentations here and lay out their view on autonomy. So I invite comments and questions from everyone, but especially from the various authors that have contributed as well. But let me nevertheless, to kick off the discussion, let me just make a point or two. And the first one is, so why do we still, and why do movements use the term autonomy? If it is this nebulous, what is it that makes it a preferential or a term that is worth organizing around, if that is the case? So that to me is as a political strategy, why does this make sense, if it does? Second point was that it was clear from the presentation by Elisa and Leandro that there are the indigenous and there are the peasant autonomy movements that sometimes work together and sometimes do not. Now, what if we then also deconstruct the peasant, as Kees did by arguing that how does the idea of more autonomy go with the processes of accumulation from below? So what is the relationship between economic realities and economic divisions and political categories of autonomy? Also, if we are looking at it simply from the point of view of the peasantry. Does it exist, or what does it gloss over? Is it useful for what? And of course, Kees's first point is autonomy useless? What kind of dependency instead? But that is kind of, I think that underlies the debates and the presentations, all three presentations, that the kind of autonomy we're talking about actually are engagement, and therefore also potentially dependency. It is a reworking of relationship with the states and with the market. But it is a nicely provocative way, of course, to say, does it mean autonomy as a concept is useless? Why do we use it? And why is it used? So if people, please raise your hand, both literally or by using the raise hand function for your comments. Helena, we will take a few comments and then we'll return to the roundtable panelists. Helena.
Okay, I thought you were going to give them a chance to reply to your question, but
let's have a couple of more questions.
So I have first a question for Kees and then a question for Leandro / Alice. And my question / comment for Kees is about, and I think it applies also to the other two, with this difficulty we have in approaching either peasantry or the different actors and groups in agrarian social formations, and this dichotomy where it's increasingly evident how limited our insights are if we can only look at the identitary or political in this location from the material and the economic. And I think that two presentations struggle to bring those two aspects together. And I think this bears some implications for this discussion, because in the case of Kees, because you're preaching to the choir in that, a lot of us share your views and your critique of some essentialist approaches to the peasantry as a conceptual category. So that is all very fine. And a materialist sort of like deconstruction of it, I think it's not hard to put together in a very coherent form. But it is the case that the peasantry and autonomy as a condition of the peasantry is, also draws from a strong identitary tropos in very, very specifically. And I wonder to what extent the whole special issue has a bit of a Latin American bias. In the Latin American tradition of not only the acceptance from academia of the category of the peasants and the sort of like reluctance to tease out what is problematic about it as an analytical category, but also the fact the very prominent importance of campesino identity as a political fact on the ground. So my question for Kees would be, sort of like, can our critique be limited to the material production, exchange, and sort of like economic realm of peasantry and autonomy within the peasantry? Or are we at this point not, really called to extend our critique and to make a reality, this attempt to synthesize the material and the political in our critique? And I'm just a bit also concerned that, when autonomy starts sliding to the autarkic and the individualist, and what does it mean also for the ability to construct a concept that really allows to see further. And my comment and question to Leandro and Alice is perhaps kind of like the opposite. I wonder if there's in the interpretation of autonomy, there's not a tendency to end up diluting the substance of the concept when when you're proposing that demanding a certain form of integration to markets is an example of autonomy. And it would seem to me either the antithesis of what seems to be a more traditional conception of autonomy, or simply calling autonomy something that other authors perhaps would refer to as, control or ways of mobilizing power, or class power, and this goes back to my question of whether there may be a Latin American bias in that you know, the ways in which a lot of the categories that you discussed combine class, ethnicity, identities, generation, and caste. We've shown in previous issues and you know, in the different papers published before in the Journal of Agrarian Change, the far more problematic assemblages in Australia, or in the case of India with scheduled caste and Adivasis, in South Africa around you know, sort of like traditional authorities and indigeneity. So without asking you to kind of like provide us with a concept of autonomy that has sort of like global purchase, isn't there a risk of reading from a very Latin American stance, reading out and proposing categories that perhaps do not really fly as well elsewhere in other agrarian settings?
Thanks. No, I think that's fine. This has to be a discussion. And while I will ask the three panelists to respond to these sets of questions and comments now, I do notice that we have Cedric Schneider and Subir Sinha waiting. Of course, two contributors to the special issue. That certainly shows that it is not only Latin American in the sense that only one of these two are Latin Americanists. But let us first go to the panel and comments from the panel. So we start from the same order as before this time, and then reverse the order next time around. So Kees.
Okay, thank you, Jens. I will respond to Helena. Helena, thanks for the questions. I think there are many aspects in the questions, so I'm afraid I cannot deal with them all. I don't think that our article is only thinking about the material or the economic. So it's already, you ask for a synthesis, but one of the reasons to let's say to deconstruct a little bit what is in the new peasantries, because the argument plays a political role. So I think that is the strength of the book. That what I see, at least in discussions with students or people in the field, they are behind this book because it creates a certain kind of emotions. It's something it fulfills a political role. So it's a performative book in that sense. So that's precisely the reason why we think it's important to look at it. It's complicated how this analysis of, let's say, the differentiation of farmers based on how they are related in the production process in terms of distribution of the means of resources, the organization of labor, and so on, how that relates to political identity. But what I experienced, for example, in Honduras, where I lived quite some time in the village, that there was a village with little history of political organization, a little bit, but people in their daily language, they differentiate among themselves. Oh, that's a rich coffee farmer. I would like to be one. So that is there, but that's also one of that are the rich of the village, and I'm a poor. I don't have anything. So that is also differentiation. Is also a talk about that kind of identity, and what we argue is that you have to see that. It takes a lot of work to see that kind of relationships at the local level between economic relationships, identity, and politics, which is different than what happens at the level of political movements, social movements, and land reform organizations. Yeah? And the interesting of the book of the New Peasantries of Jan Douwe is that it talks about autonomy in, let's say, in the daily, everyday life situation. It's not so much a book about political movements. Of course, there are places in the book where that topic comes up. But basically, it's an argument about what is this farmer in terms of economics and identity. And we have a different take on that. So I'm not sure whether that's clear enough about this separation of economics and identity. But but that's precisely the issue, how to think about it. And I think already Jens said already something about the bias. Yeah, I don't think it's a bias. I think it was a little bit unfortunate. We tried we had somebody probably writing about Africa, but then that dropped out and so on. But we tried to, but it was more sort of circumstantial that there are a lot of Latin American contributions. But we are pleased to have on India and other places also present in a special issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Let us go on to Elisa.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I try to put all together for Jens and Elena. Of course, I cannot apologize for my Latin American bias, but I think many of the findings I have in Bolivia, I have worked a lot in Africa, mainly in Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa. I would say that many things are very similar. This in South Africa also, there is a whole movement of getting autonomy and land rights through the state and law and constitution. So I see many similarities with the Bolivian process that one will not expect. But thinking about why still to use autonomy, since that we are all problematizing, and if this is not autonomy, if it's only a relational reframing, not the relation with state society, if you should call other way. Look, and then it's relation also with the question of identities that Elena posed. And identities could be by itself a whole special issue as well in the concept of identities. But I adopt here an interpretative approach that is based on the interpretation of the very same actors. So I'm not telling that their struggles are struggles for autonomy. They are calling their struggles for autonomy. So what I'm doing here is taking serious what they define as autonomy. So it's not that I am, as you said, Elena, diluting the sense of the concept of autonomy. I'm doing a bottom-up exercise methodologically to give the concept or the contents that are given by the very same actors that are involving in these struggles. I'm not putting words in there. They put these words in their manifestos, in their declarations, in their demands to the state. So it's really not to say, okay, anything that's against the establishment's autonomy, but try to really not take for granted what we read in the literature, but try to do this articulated reflection on autonomy, both looking that, okay, autonomy is an invention of the Enlightenment and is a modern promise, but it had been appropriated and reframed and rethought by a multiplicity of actors in a different ways. So it's more about that. The same also with identities, like I was struggling, you can see also Leandro struggle a bit, the peasantry indigenous thing. Yeah, it's complicated, but in my own experience of field work, there is a multiplicity there as well. I work with the coca growers many years, and individually they identify themselves as member of originary people, not indigenous, originary, but politically they don't present themselves as that. So there is also a very complicated tension in the, you have really, I believe, to answer your both questions, why autonomy and why these identities, what I try methodologically is to really adopt, take serious these interpretations given by these collectivities. And finally, yes, just to join Jens and relation what Keys also present, I think is very interesting this conflict, and Leandro talk about the peasant indigenous and how sometimes they're together. Take into account the difficulty of this typology. Any typology is as bad as the next, but somehow we need some typology if you want to have some synthetic debates. Multiplicity, sometimes we have to put some analytical order, not to say that the things in reality is so defined. But I think Leandro point out and go together with Keys and Jens, and I think something that we can, it's really formal work, how this, these fights from below, this possession from below And in the Latin American case, at least, this is manifested a lot in everyday life and alliances, and not alliances, in political moments between indigenous, peasant originary. So I think there also, it's a very rich scope for keeping debating, of the bottom fights. I think about, peasants in free trades, other fair trade, others they are not, etc. So on. So just join saying that yes, this possession from below, I think, is a very important topic.
Thanks, and very interesting. I mean, so if it is so that autonomy is a concept that is easily used by different movements, what does it mean for our understanding of the movements? Can they be reactionary and still use the term autonomy? I mean, is it what does it do? Because autonomy is normally seen as something progressive in a sense, at least. So the more it's just used by various groups, the less maybe it should be seen like that. But,
sorry, one point is used by the white separatists in Bolivia. They talk about internal colonialism and autonomy. So
interesting. Sorry for butting in there. Anyway, Leandro, over to you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I won't take much time because I think there is a Latin American bias. No, Elena, it's not true. No, but there are papers on Cambodia. There are papers that are theoretical, and there are papers on India. It's true that there's a bit more Latin America. I see Kyla also on the screen. She has a paper on Colombia. But what I also agree with saying that there is a bias, because I agree with a lot of Alisa has been saying, and our way of approaching autonomy is not, and I think this is like a deja vu. We've had these discussions so many times. It's not about, autonomy is not autarky. It's not an absolute. Like any other concept or like any other project, you achieve certain levels of what you're trying to get. And the movements use this term. So if they use this term, it means that they are seeking certain kinds of things with it, right? So what we as scholars need to do is to try to organize this concept in terms of categories, in terms of ways of assessing it. And that's why, for example, we provided these terms of market avoidance, market integration, market creation, and Van der Ploeg and Sergio have offered other types of concepts. But this idea that autonomy is an inherent condition of the peasants, if you've read what we were trying to do, or if that's not our position. Our position is that it is a struggle, it is a utopia, and then peasants try to all kinds of mechanisms through the state, against the state, within the state, or against the market, within the market, and some of them fail, some of them work, right? So I, for example, would be very skeptic of movements being able to really reach autonomy through the market. But it's basically because of the kind of understanding that I have of the market. But I also need to recognize that other scholars, other people have different understanding of the market. And that was the whole point of having this special issue. We don't all agree on our categories. We don't all agree on what the market is, the way it works, if there is any room for autonomy within it or not. And then we put the test of the movements and their practices and even the theory to the test of cases to see if it actually matches what they say it does. And then we have very, very different outcome or conclusions. One last thing I want to say is that, you know, we've had this discussion again. I said, you know, when we use the term peasant, it doesn't mean we're talking about one type of peasant. it doesn't mean that there's no fragmentation within the peasantry. It doesn't mean that there are not rich, poor, middle peasants, and that there are peasants that differentiate themselves through caste or other means, right? But it means that it makes it even more difficult to find this quote unquote peasant unity. And it means, but it doesn't mean also that peasants in their struggle are not trying to generate that unity. And our case at least shows that that fragmentation is so open now that it makes it very, very, very difficult to find a unity between that diversity. So I reject this idea that the peasantry is not fragmented when you use the term peasant.
Excellent, thanks. And I mean, the very idea and the very fact that you have brought all this out in the open and that you have enabled us to discuss autonomy the way you are discussing it now is excellent. I mean, it's to me, it's a big step forward in working with the categories, thinking through the category. But let us go to Sergio Snyder, Subia Sinha, and Matteo Rezac. Sergio.
So thank you very much, Jens, and greetings for all, for everyone. It's nice to see you all here. So a big pleasure. So I would like to start with a question to Kees and later finish with another one to Leandro. To Kees, I have been giving speeches for a lot of farmers' unions and social movements around Brazil and Latin America. And the point is about useful or useless of autonomy concept, and this is also addressed Jens' comments on that difficulties. Well, the point what I would like to raise to you, Kees, is if you would be invited for instance, Via Campesina International, or even MST in Brazil, or even the Zapatistas in Mexico, a big room with about 2,000-3,000 people sitting on their chairs, and would you say to them that autonomy that is they fight for, it's something useless? Would you say that for such people? So that's my point. You cannot we cannot say what is useless or not for what the other ones they want to what they say by their self think what is their identity. So this is my point, and I would like to make a bit of criticism about the terms. Autonomy, it's of course is problematic, it's slippery, it's ubiquitous, but it's not because that social science and especially sociology should not deal with. Because what applies to autonomy applies to other concepts. For instance, I would say the one that is the most problematic, development. The definition of development. I'm teaching development for students. I spend the whole semester, and at the end, the students always ask the same, hey, teacher, please tell me then what is development in 5 words. It is impossible to say. The same, justice. What is justice? Or even, for instance, democracy. What is democracy? What is the concept of democracy? So all these kinds of terms and social science in general deal with slippery, ubiquitous concepts. And it's not because they are ubiquitous and slippery that they are useless. So that's the point. So they are not useless by the science, and they are not useless by the people that fight for this concept. So the 2 points. And then by saying that, I would like to say that, and in this, I would start to remind or maybe make a point to Leandro's presentation. Leandro, you rightly highlight the 5 themes or focus that we discussed in the seminar in Wageningen. But I think, and I would like to ask to you maybe to elaborate a little bit more on the discussion that we had about the epistemological or theoretical basis on autonomy. Because without that, without to discuss what are the theoretical basis or what are the point of view from theoretical perspective, we cannot come up with the consensus on if autonomy is useless or not. So useless or useful of a concept is always a grasp, is always linked to certain perspective, to certain epistemological perspective. So, and then I would say that the autonomy depends on the level of the analysis. It depends on the epistemological position, and also it depends on what you rightly highlight is on the ontological position. And ontological means the political position, because social science is not neutral. We have always a political bias on our on science. So that by that saying, and why I'm saying that, because on the paper that we submit to GAC, and this has widely consequences, because sometimes you go to discuss your theoretical perspective, for instance, a structuralist perspective, or a political economist, or an hermeneutic perspective. But another social scientist, another colleague of you has another perspective. So we cannot come up with the same conclusions. And sometimes you get comments on your paper when you submit it to a journal, and people say, oh, you are using the concept in that way. But I think in my perspective is not like that. So, but come on, if we are looking at the same subject, the same topic, with different epistemological perspective, with different glasses, how we expect, how we wait that we came up with the same conclusions. So this has a major consequences for our field of work in agrarian studies. We have to agree that even though we have slippery difficulties, we have ubiquity, this doesn't matter. This doesn't mean that we cannot come up and discuss and see what this can produce in terms of the explanation of the empirical and the reality. So this would be my comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergio. I think that was a clear response to the provocation whether autonomy is useless. So we will return to the speakers, but first we'll take all three other participants, and then we'll have one last round from the speakers. We will probably run a bit over time, but not much, I hope. So, Subir, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jens, and hello, everyone. I was not in the original list of participants in the workshop or the conferences, so actually it has been very useful for me to listen to the editors and where they were coming from. And in fact, I was quite struck by the fact that many of the passages that Kees was referring to from Van der Ploeg are exactly the passages that I am addressing in my paper as well. So a kind of a bizarre telepathy with someone I've not corresponded with or met before. Having said that, and also this maybe has a kind of a slight connection with Sergio's point. I mean, for me, yeah, obviously there's a Latin America focus, not just for the volume, but I think for the concept of autonomy in sort of general. And I think it has a particularity with respect to, the emergence, the political emergence of indigenous subjectivity, the emphasis on community going back to the works even of Florencia Mayon and so on some years ago. And so from my point of view, coming from India and looking at kind of Indian rural politics, it is an interesting but a very different kind of a trajectory. And so in my sort of paper, one of the things that I'm looking to do is to explain why this difference actually exists between what one could say about India and what people are saying about Latin America. And one of the reasons that it seems to me this difference kind of exists, and I think it's productive to think along those lines, is to place the ambiguity on questions of peasantness, on control, difference, and ultimately on autonomy within the larger sort of unfolding of the universalization of capitalism and of capitalist modernity more broadly within the Indian context. So, for example, historically speaking, if one is looking at questions like autonomy from the market, then one could go back to pre-British, even Mughal times, and look at Indian agriculture at that point and see how the revenue demands of the state at that point in time affected choices made by smallholder farmers in terms of what they were going to produce and in what kind of land and near what kind of natural endowments and things like that. So in a way, the kind of collapsing of what Van der Ploeg calls empire, a concept against which he places autonomy, is not really specific to neither capitalism nor colonialism, but in fact goes back a little bit further to earlier sort of periods of the emergence of quasi-modern states with revenue and taxation and the like. So to some extent, it is, I think, important to put the question of autonomy within regionally specific unfolding dynamics of the universalization of capitalism, by which I mean some version of the agrarian transition with its own degrees of incompleteness and so on. So that's one thing. The second thing that I sort of think is interesting and important to think of here is how these various kinds of autonomy that Van der Ploeg, but also the editors in their introduction talk about, play against each other. So, for example, one could think in terms of a variety of episodes within rural social movements in India, where what you're looking at is demands for state intervention on behalf of those who are configured as peasants in order to have some degree of autonomy from capital. And I think all of those episodes of forming cooperatives or having state support for minimum price supports for various agricultural products and so on can be seen as a degree of state intervention in some domains in order for some amount of control over decision making in other kinds of activities and domains. And I think that's maybe a second one. A third one is, I think, the very over the last 20 odd years, how notions of autonomy and specifically peasant autonomy and peasant community autonomy have been almost entirely internalized within neoliberal governance and within neoliberal forms of accumulation. So if one is to think in terms of community-based natural resource management or management of different kinds of water bodies, which are all geared towards enhanced participation in the market by the people of these different communities, then this is part and parcel of the incorporation of the autonomous capacities of communities within neoliberal governance and within neoliberal, sort of forms of accumulation. And then finally, in terms of why do people say that they want autonomy when that is not necessarily sort of connecting with sort of the point that Sergio raised very sort of spiritedly. Here I sort of work on the question of political subjectivity and, the question regarding, what Spivak calls strategic essentialism comes to play, which is when, as Leandro said in response to Elena, I think very few people would make the claim that peasant is just a unitary category. But it is then why do people come into the political arena and present themselves as peasants and as making a claim to that kind of unity, which actually objectively does not exist? And there, I think one has to think in terms of particular dynamics of post-colonial politics in which certain categories, like the peasantry, have a long resonance well beyond the empirical reference of those kinds of subjectivities. So even though I think, strictly speaking, and bizarrely, I find Van der Ploeg acknowledging this in some of the chapters, there is a massive diversity within that particular concept. But the fact that people still use that concept in order to present themselves in the political arena, I think has to do with the kinds of resonances different sort of versions of the word peasant or peasant community or peasant autonomy have within given political kinds of settings. So thanks very much.
Great, Tobias. Thanks for those comments, which of course the panel may also want to comment on themselves when it's their turn. Matteo Resnack.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. I will try to make my question as short and fast as possible. Basically, I was thinking about the Leandro point on how this autonomy created achievements, but from the other side also exacerbated other problems. And I was thinking at the same time about this Tony Negri concept of autonomy that he talks in his book, Empire, the Intermezzo. It is about how mobility and labor migrants are central in overthrowing the capitalist regime. So I was wondering how this mobility concept is related, and if maybe as some sort of solution, obviously considering the different perspectives and how every group and individual experiences this autonomy concept. Yeah, I was wondering, how does this mobility enter in all of this discussion? And also these solidarity ties and networks that are created, where do the urban areas enter on this? Because we are talking about all these rural areas, different indigenous or peasant movements, and how they can be interrelated, and also related with the mobility, how transnational movements also can be related, or trans-border movements. I was thinking, for instance, about the Mapuche struggles, where like Chile being the country of like the laboratory of neoliberalism, all these clashes with the authorities for owning the land. So I would like, maybe this is more for Leandro, the question, which kind of parallelism would you find between the Mapuche case and the cases studied in Nicaragua, Mexico, etc., etc. And also the last question is about the gender issue, how the concept of autonomy can be related with different perceptions on gender distribution of labor. That's all.
Thanks, Matteo, for complicating the picture even more. And I do mean that. That is positive. Excellent. Carla Grass.
Yes. Thank you for such interesting presentations and for this discussion. Much of the points I wanted to raise have been have been done by my the two colleagues that spoke before me. But I wanted to underline I found it very interesting, this point of departure that Alice underlined, that is taking seriously how people construct their own meanings of, and I think that to make sense of that is from us as researchers or observers of these processes. Subir said something that I totally agree with, that we have to be aware of how these different meanings and dimensions of what people term as autonomy, because that's what we are interested in mostly. We have to be aware how they are intertwined in specific times and places, and also been problematic, but how to understand the meaning of peasantry or state, or we have to also be aware of the historical processes of integration of these different populations to the modern state and to citizenship. And but I also wanted to take, and because I at least in my own experience, when some grades of autonomy in one of the levels, in market or through cooperatives or in political terms, it certainly has very ambiguous effects in other spheres of autonomy. And this is part of the problem. And just to end, I wanted to take up, I think that what Sergio was telling, and I think that the problem to say with the difficulty with autonomy, it's not that it's a slippery concept. To me, it is more, it functions more than like a paradox, in the sense that you achieve some kind of autonomy and then the problem changes, but still is still posed, no? With justice, one could say the same. So I would think I better prefer to think it like that. But what you the issue it was raising, it could be another roundtable, but it's not. It's also very important, and it regards our role as researchers and activists. But we are not peasants. We are not indigenous peoples. We are academics. So, which would be our role? And let's say we don't say that the concept is useless, but we are seeing a lot of problems and tensions and disputes around this this concept. Should we be blind to that? Should we assess them before social movements or peasant communities, or is that supposed to be a problem because it can also weaken their strength? That was something that was pointed to me when I said something about one of these problems. And the last thing that I wanted to point is the other thing that we have to be aware of is the different scales in which the fight for the struggle for autonomy are played. It may be obvious, but sometimes we tend to make a straight line between the household, the community. Another notion for me that should be put under the spotlight and discussed, what are we talking about when we say peasant communities or indigenous communities, and the national level, and of course transnational level. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. So I think it is now 3 minutes past 7. So we are running over now. And of course, it's great that we still have 30 people taking part. But yeah, well, and we will go through with the final round from the speakers. And at least they will all be available online. So if people have to drop out now because they have other things planned, so be it. But it will let us take a round with all 3 speakers. Before that, let me acknowledge that we have a message from Irna on Central Asia, Tajikistan, in the chat. It's too long for me to summarize, I think. And it's a comment, but absolutely worth looking at. Can I suggest that the 3 speakers spend not more than 5 minutes each, and you don't have to answer all questions. Focus on what you find most important, or if you want to answer all of them within 5 minutes. And we start from the end, which is Leandro first.
Okay, that was a surprise. Thank you, Jens. I think the discussion is fascinating, and it should give you an idea of the kind of seminar that we had in Wageningen. And that was the whole objective of the special issue. It was to bring people from very different perspectives, from very different theoretical background and approaches. So what Sergio asks me to answer in terms of epistemology and ontology, in terms of finding, or if we could have found a common ground, I think it was not the point. I think it wouldn't have been impossible. But what was interesting and important about the special issue, and it is important about the special issue, is that it's an inter-paradigm discussion. That's the title of our introduction, me and Kees. And we wanted to bring people that were pro, quote unquote, autonomy, That's what Sergio and Van der Ploeg were there at the seminar, were presenting their ideas. We had people that were in the middle, let's say, and we had people that were harshly critical of it, like Case was, and we had everyone in the middle. I would consider myself within the pro autonomy side, but not in the same vein that Van der Ploeg is. But we were there discussing the concept, the ideas, and the issue was also a recognition of that and an invitation to start discussing our categories, discussing our approaches, but not simplifying them. So I'm again a bit torn here, not torn, but I'm surprised that we can still continue and say, well, when you use the term peasant, you're talking about unitary subject. We are not. And when you're talking about autonomy, well, you're talking about autarky. We are not anymore. No one is. But starting to have that debate, I think, will maybe bring us closer to understanding different approaches, different theories. And I just want to say something about Mateo's question and Subir's intervention, and maybe bring in also Carla's comment on when we talk about autonomy, what is left.
In 2-3 minutes, please.
Yes. We have interventions and contribution on gender, and how autonomy is seen differently depending on your gender roles. Even early on in the 1990s, women were already struggling for autonomy within movements. They were using the term autonomy in order to create space for themselves within movements, in order to push the gender agenda within movements. So gender has always been part of the discussions on autonomy, and there is a peculiar understanding of autonomy from the feminist perspective that makes its way within the special issue. But to maybe end with this idea of that the concept is Latin American, or it has a peculiar Latin American content, maybe to a certain degree, but don't forget that through the work of Arde Negri, for example, you see that term being used for the alter globalization movement, for the subject that is supposed to resist the empire. And alter globalization movement in the North have been using autonomy for many, many years. So it's not a concept that is limited to Latin America. It's a concept that is used in many different places. And last word, on Subir's comment between the association of the rise of autonomy and neoliberalism. In our paper, at least, with Miguel, Victor, and Blanca, we look at that contradiction. And by using the term neoliberal multiculturalism that Rosamel Millaman and Charles Hale have coined, showing that neoliberalism allowed for these struggles to emerge, and it allowed for reforms to the state. And it was very tricky and contradictory for indigenous movement to start using that discourse, trying to take advantage of it, because in a contradictory way, it brought them further away from frontal critique to neoliberalism. So the whole thing is contradictory, and we do recognize that autonomy and struggle for autonomy happened within a very, very peculiar neoliberal context. Thank you.
Thank you, Leandro. Let us move on to Elisa.
Very punctual, just relation again what Sergio said, no, that I think Sergio and Carla point the same thing that I try to point out, that to take very serious what the actors are saying, it's also related with ontological, epistemological, and axiological decision. And these definitely will lead us to different answers in this debate that should be all respected since when and always, provided that there is internal consistency. So if you use if the actors are using this concept, and I'm departing from an axiological position that's of critical theory, from an epistemological, ontological position that reality is created by the interpretation, I cannot throw the concept out because me as academics think it's not useful if they are using and operating it. So I think you know, I respect all the different positions, but you have to have this coherence. And in my case, looking from this bottom-up construction of the notion, if they're using it, it's not in my position to say if they should keep using this or not. The other point I want to thank a lot, Carla, is something that we did from the beginning. Our article was looking at these big national organizations, but as I said, there is these tensions within, and I haven't thought in the terms you put, but it's very interesting, and I don't think we discussed much that. I don't have seen the final paper of all the colleagues, but there is a whole debate also of what is the analytical level when we're talking about autonomy, and that's a very interesting idea. I think most of us are talking about autonomy in this level of big organizations, states, but there is an article, as Leandro said, about the gender perspective, and this, I think, also complexify even more the debate about the concept. If you think about in which level, I see that these movements, as I said, we are resorting to a simplification, but there are fights within these organizations, what they're defining about autonomy. You know, the project, we look at the ones that win the political fight, but the women within these organizations have a different notion. So these to put in terms also and make more clear from where we are talking, it's important also to say each analytical level we are looking. And also what you said, it's also one of the points that we want to make, you know, that I totally agree, Carla. Autonomy is always a project, so it will never be achieved. So you always be redefined and always will be going on and on and on. You know, so that's the point of departure, where we come from, and totally agree. And the last point for relation with Subir, really is important to think also these multiple subjectivities, that the subjectivities could be politicized or not, could be rationalized or not. I am Brazilian, but politically I don't act and perform as a Brazilian, not even academically. I am in Bolivia. So also to differentiate these subjectivities, how they are performed or not in public spaces, politicized or not, and so on. And I think that's what, and finally also, as Leandro said, the debate, autonomy, heteronomy, so on, it's very long trajectory. In rural agrarian scenarios, yes, I think contemporary became very related with the neoliberal struggle. And then just to close and going back to Elena, maybe that's why we focus so much in Latin America, because it's one of a very portrayed that successful struggle of autonomy, indigenous and peasant autonomy against neoliberalism. And now, after the end of the pink tide, we're having to come to terms how successful it actually was or not. So, yes, I think there is also not only the Latin American bias, but the autonomy versus neoliberal bias is something that since the 90s had been quite strong in agrarian studies when we talk about autonomy.
Thank you.
Thank a lot. And
thank you.
With that I finish.
Thank you. Let me also point out there is now a new comment in the chat by Naoya Matsudaira. But let us go on to Case.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I will mainly respond to Sergio. Thank you, Sergio, for your remarks. Of course, that statement, autonomy is useless, was basically in terms of an analytical discussion. It's something I would not directly say in a situation where I would be in front of a bunch of Via Campesina movements. But I think we can have, in this kind of debates, it's not to repeat the language from movements as such. So we have, I think, another role as academics. But if groups have what Subir called a strategic essentialism or a political subjectivity that autonomy is important, then, and I would, in that kind of meetings, who am I then to go against it? I would more try to raise questions, and then come back to some of the things we have written about and I've said. first, maybe in such a context, I would raise, okay, you have all kinds of alternatives, autonomous alternatives. What kind of new dependencies might be created if you follow that path, and then discuss those kind of questions. So this issue of what are the different, if you try to finish one type of market relationship but introduce another, then the question becomes, so does it create new dependencies? What are these? And maybe there would be a debate to identify those. Then still the issue of contradictory interest within a farmer population could be a point of discussion. To give an example, there was a certain moment, a farmer cooperative, a coffee cooperative in Honduras, very much trying to develop their own markets through fair trade markets and so on. And when the coffee prices suddenly rised, they came together, they organized, and they decided not to pay more to the people who would pick the coffee. Well, in the village where I lived, there was no farmer organization. Let's say the salary or the amount of money paid for the task increased together with the price of coffee. So that kind of topics you could debate or you could discuss with such a well-organized group developing their autonomous market relationship. Yeah, but if you do that, what about the other groups in your villages? Do they also profit from it or not? So the issue of contradictory interests, also when people proclaim autonomy and alternative development, I think is still an issue that we should not push aside. And then a final point with this is that, of course, farmer organizations are political movements which often use another language than let's say, the non-organized farmers in the villages. And that is also something to look at it, which may not be supporting a project of autonomy, but in fact see also when they participate in movements, see them more as a possibility to become connected to different markets, to different organizations in new ways to increase to improve their livelihoods. So there are still issues to be discussed. So I think, of course, I would not say autonomous is useless, but I think there is a lot of ground still to discuss based on the things that I raised. Maybe I'll finish here because of time.
Thank you, Kees. Now, before I thank everyone, let me just alert you to that the next Agrarian Change Seminar is in exactly a week's time, where Harun Akram Lodi will do a face-to-face seminar at SOAS, which will also be a webinar on agroecology and the agrarian question in the 21st century. But that is next week. Today, what is left is to thank the roundtable participants for an excellent debate, as well as everyone else that had participated and made it even more lively, and covered such a variety of issues, while we of course still left with agreements and disagreements and points of clarification. That is how it should be. So thank you very much, everyone. And